Good afternoon, and welcome to the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. My name is Jeff Griffith-Parham, and I am the Film Exhibition Curatorial Associate here. Thank you for coming out for Climate Journalism on Screen and today's screening of The White House Effect. Climate Journalism on Screen is a collaboration between BAMPFA and the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. In particular, the two co-curators of the series, Jason Spingarn-Koff and Jennifer Redfearn, both faculty, filmmakers, and pioneers in the field of climate documentary. A little bit about both of them. Jason Spingarn-Koff is a professor of journalism and the Knight Chair of Climate Journalism at UC Berkeley. He was previously director of original documentary programming at Netflix, where he oversaw more than 100 global films and series, with honors including 4 Academy Awards for the company. He was formerly the commissioning editor for Opinion Video at the New York Times, where he launched and oversaw the acclaimed OpDocs series. Jason is under the weather, so he will not be moderating tonight, but you'll be able to see Jason next Saturday for Nocturnes. So more on that to come. Jennifer Redfearn is an Academy Award and Emmy Award nominated filmmaker and the director of the documentary program here at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. Jennifer will fill in for Jason and moderate the post-screening conversation today. And she will also be back on the final screening of the series, February 23rd, for the Battle of Laikipia. Through a series of 4 screenings this month, Climate Journalism on Screen will highlight recent work ambitious enough to reckon with the history and ideas that brought us to our current state, stare into the climate crisis, and boldly explore ways forward. All of the programs will be accompanied by post-screening discussion, some, like today's, with the filmmakers, some drawing on the expertise of UC Berkeley and one UCSF faculty and researchers. Each of the 4 movies utilize varying documentary techniques to explore very different subjects under a very, very large globe-encompassing umbrella of climate change. Screening this upcoming Saturday, as mentioned, February 8th, Nocturnes tracks a small research team through the verdant eastern Himalayas for a study of the local population of hawk moths. Beautiful movie, and the sound is just incredible, so you don't want to miss out. Screening next Sunday, February 9th, Plastic People is an investigative chronicle of the exponential growth of the plastics industry and its environmental, geopolitical, and physiological impact. Both screenings come with an impressive panel of subject matter experts, so you don't want to miss out on that. Today, we are thrilled to kick things off with The White House Effect from filmmakers Bonnie Cohen, Jon Shenk, and Pedro Cos. We are lucky enough to have Jon Shenk here in person. Bonnie Cohen also under the weather and cannot make it. As well as we are lucky to have producer and head of production at Actual Films, Justine Nagan. They'll be discussing the movie with us after the screening. So please stick around for that Q&A and conversation with Jennifer Redfearn and you. Bonnie Cohen and Jon Shenk are the co-founders of the San Francisco-based production company Actual Films. Jon Shenk is the director of The Island President from 2011, for which Bonnie Cohen served as a producer. Shenk and Pedro Cos co-directed the Academy Award-nominated Lead Me Home from 2021, for which Cohen also produced. Together, Shenk and Cohen are the co-directors of the Peabody-winning Audrey and Daisy from 2016, an inconvenient sequel, Truth to Power, from 2017, and the Emmy-winning Athlete A from 2020. Shenk is also the cinematographer on all of these films. Just this past year, in 2024, when The White House Effect had its world premiere at the Telluride Film Festival, it wasn't their only film premiering. They also debuted Waves and War, which follows a military veteran's therapeutic treatment of PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, and severe depression via the use of psychedelics. So be on the lookout for that one as well. So please join me in welcoming Jon Shenk to introduce The White House Effect, and thank you again for coming.
Those people sound busy. Thank you for coming out, braving the sideways rain, to come to what I think is church here in Berkeley. This got to be one of the nicest theaters in the Bay Area. I'm so happy to have a nice crowd of friends and colleagues here to watch The White House Effect today. Let's see. Bonnie sends her love. She really wishes she could have been here, so she is here in spirit. Pedro is down in Los Angeles, having just been one of the Angelinos that survived the fires down there, so he couldn't be here either. But I'll try to make do for the team today after the screening. By the way, we're going to, given that this is like the church of cinema, we're going to let the credits roll to the end. So just be patient. It's actually kind of fun to watch. You'll see all the thousands of archival sources that we used in making this giant jigsaw puzzle. The White House Effect started life about 5 or 6 years ago. Bonnie and Pedro and I had collaborated on a couple of different climate change related films. It's kind of an issue, I guess you could say, that's very near and dear to us. We've all felt very strongly about it for a long time. We're always asking ourselves, how can we tell this story in new ways, to bring in new audiences, to find new perspectives on this, to see if we can move the needle on the conversation that is so important to everybody. This one kind of started as a question, something like, how could we tell the story of how we got to this place in our country where, half of us believe in the science of climate change and half of us don't believe in the science of climate change. And it seems like a basic question, but that led to this film. It ended up being 100% archival film. The elements that make up this film do not include any in which we picked up a camera or a microphone. So everything you're about to see comes from historical records, all the major networks and other sources, home video, and some documents that have been declassified and found after the fact, but mostly stuff that was available at the time that it aired or it was made. It spans mostly the decades of the 80s and 90s, but kind of goes back and forth in time as well. You'll see. Anyways, I don't want to ruin it for you. I won't say anything else, but please stick around for the Q&A after the credits finish. Nice to be here. Thank you.
That was an extraordinary experience. Please join me again in giving Jon Shenk and Justine Nagan a huge round of applause. I wanted to start back at the beginning. Jon, you talked a little bit about this in your introduction, but could you bring us a little bit more into the origin of the project and the thinking behind it?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you again for coming today. And thank you, Jennifer, for hosting the Q&A, for moderating the Q&A. Let's see. Yeah. In 2018, there was a extraordinary article. Really, the entire Sunday Times magazine was dedicated to one single piece of journalism called "Losing Earth" by a journalist named Nathaniel Rich, who is the brilliant son of another journalist, Frank Rich. And Nat had one of his beats is climate change related journalism, and he did something which I had never seen quite like, which he told a narrative that roughly covered a similar. He concentrated on the 1980s, but he really brought the characters to life. He based his reporting on new interviews with folks like Rafe Pomerantz, who was a major environmentalist in the 80s, and politicians and scientists, and that got Bonnie and myself and Pedro thinking, maybe there's something to do, with a film that could go back to that time and tell this story in an emotional, character-driven way. Of course, as soon as we started to look for footage of those people that Nat had spoken to, we found almost nothing. So the project changed immediately, but that basic DNA of trying to figure out a kind of a character-based emotional arc that would roughly follow this time frame when the science of climate change was kind of becoming very public for the first time, and as Al Gore says, moving out of the scientific realm into the political realm, also for the first time in the early mid 1980s. So that's the germ of how the project began.
It's extraordinary to witness that, and also the journalism at that time, and the science and the public's understanding of the science at that time. Could you bring us a little bit into, or could you talk about the formal approach to the film and creatively how you thought about treating this story?
Sure. First of all, I should recognize some people. John Else is here, who I think I had one of the first conversations about this project with. Must have been 6 years ago. We had coffee to talk about this. We really, also Bonnie and my teacher, Chris Samuelson, is here. Bonnie and I were, kind of grew up on classic documentaries that really brought us into the field. Things like Koyaanisqatsi, that series of films, and John's program, Eyes on the Prize, which told the story of the civil rights movement historically, which was done in the 80s, 1980s, and I think it was the 80s, early 90s, late 80s, and films like that always seems out of reach. They're kind of these bigger than life projects that this seem like Herculean in scope and task, and we felt like a new era was upon us where we could go back and do something of that scope, but obviously it would have to have a different flavor given the subject matter. And John and I talked about that. What could that be? How could you do that? So that was our ambition early on, was to do that. And little did we know that it would lead to this Herculean project, which that became an archival film. And I guess one other thing to say is that pretty early on, we in the DNA of this project, we wanted something that would be something approaching unimpeachable. Something that felt like you couldn't argue with it. It was, and that's where the 100% archival kind of style came into place. We felt like, okay, if we base this on historical evidence, we don't bring our POV into the present day production aspect of the film. Of course, there's point of view and editorial, but I think the lack of the point of view in the production, I think, kind of keeps it, at least in kind of feeling and style and kind of at least kind of texture in the present day of what is going on screen. So that was another important kind of piece of it early on.
Yeah, and it has this, or my experience of it is I just felt immersed in that time. Justine, the film is so well researched and beautifully edited and entertaining and enraging at times. How did the team of producers, directors, editors, and archival researchers all work together to pull this off?
Yeah, I mean, we tend to believe that most good documentaries are made in the edit, and this one, by being all archival, literally was constructed in the edit, and it was not a small challenge. We had, you probably saw in the credits, we had 3 directors, 3 producers, 3 editors, all supported by an amazing group of a large team, including Alana Romand, our assistant editor, who's here. Really trying to tackle this Herculean task. And it was a lot of dividing and conquering. So, for instance, on the directorial team, there were times when, Pedro would be working on the edit with Bonnie, and John and Noah, one of our producers, would lean in on graphics. And then, Josh Penn, one of the producers, would be managing the budget, and I would be leaning in on fundraising. So it was this constantly shifting kind of large team to cover all the things that needed to be done. There's like about 14,000 audio and visual clips that we collected, which we've been told is one of the largest climate databases and material that's ever collected. And we have hopes of finding a home for it somewhere so it can be accessible to scholars and activists. Thank you. I also just want to give a shout out to our funders because it's not a small budget. We claimed fair use on a lot of it, but we also had to license a lot of it. And so really taking that leap with us, they were really important members of our team as well.
That's great. And telling the story with this all archival, this is a question, I guess, for both of you with this all archival approach. Did that present any challenges or opportunities in fully rendering the story?
Well, yeah, it presented almost every possible challenge. We, like Justine said, we had, I don't know, at the height of this for 2 or 3, I guess 3 years or so, we had a team of 6 or 8, sometimes 10 people working, every day on looking for pieces of archival. There's everything in this from, like I said, the major networks, in many ways, I don't know if the documentary filmmakers in the crowd feel this, but watching it again today, I feel like it's almost a love letter to documentarians. Thank God for whoever was holding the camera in the Oval Office during the Bush years. You kind of, how did that person think to get the cutaway so that we could edit it? It's an important thing to remember that when you are that person with the camera at a moment that does seem like it might be of historical importance, to kind of take a breath and think about not just what you're doing, but where this footage is going to sit in kind of the annals of archival film history. And we had that happen a lot. We also had enormous frustration. We would hear about a piece of footage that, Nordvik in 1989, the first sort of UN sponsored climate world global meeting on that issue, was a pretty big event. And yet we could only find tiny little pieces, and we would beat our head against the wall going to every broadcaster in Europe. One problem we're having today is the degradation of videotape. The film assets from prior to the 80s last pretty well, and they're pretty well organized, but the video assets are just literally kind of disintegrating. You can see it in the quality. So we had a whole project of just restoration and trying to bring stuff back to life that we could only find copies of. So it was kind of a never-ending scavenger hunt.
I'll add briefly that those amazing memos from Exxon, many of those, Noah Stahl, one of our producers, befriended an old Exxon PR guy and built his trust over time. And then eventually the guy led him to his garage. And that is where those came from. And Bill Riley, also up in Healdsburg, has a barn filled with his personal archive. And a lot of the amazing behind the scenes stuff there was from his VHSs and his personal collection. And lastly, I'd just say on the archival front, really trying to immerse you in us all in those eras, thinking about the pop culture aspects that would kind of land you there, the songs and the imagery to really make you feel like you were there so it could unfold in real time was a fun search as well.
Yeah, that was a really fun aspect of experiencing the film, was just being brought back to the early days of MTV and some of those time periods. Watching the film, sort of watching the newscasters inside of the television and watching the families, for example, watch that. Creatively, the film seems to implicate the audience by stitching those kind of scenes together, and as if we're watching years and decades zoom by, as if saying we knew, we didn't do enough. And I'm curious, and this could be a question also for both of you, but how you want the audience to feel while watching the film and take away from the experience.
Well, in terms of kind of the role of the American public, that was a conscious decision that we felt like it's certainly easy to scorn the oil companies, and they deserve our scorn. But we're all in this as well, and we a lot of us who pay attention know what's going on, and some of us who've been traveling around the planet for a while have known for a while. And so we didn't want to let the American public off the hook. That's kind of how we talked about it. We wanted to show that a lot of this material was available. It has been available, continues to be available, whilst we continue to kind of prioritize other things. And I put myself in that category as well. I fly on airplanes and drive my car and live the comfortable life of contemporary times. So we wanted to remind ourselves as filmmakers, but also the American public, hopefully, that is a key ingredient to this. Of course, it gets muddled in the late 80s and early 90s when the oil companies start to intentionally try to confuse the public. It becomes more difficult to get that information, but nonetheless, it is out there.
Yeah. This time watching it, I was really thinking about how much harder it was to cause that confusion then, when there was many fewer news outlets than there are now. How much easier it is, I think, to sow seeds of discord and, as we know, fake news and all of that. Watching it, thinking about those collective news experiences, and that's what we were trying to communicate with those families and at the bar and in the newsroom, that there was this collective news experience, more so than definitely than there is now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you feel echoes of the present throughout the film. I wanted to jump to the end, those final images of the receding glaciers and the hockey stick graph are so powerful. And I'm wondering how you decided when the story should end.
That was a process. We had certainly had versions in the edit of the film that had the Clinton administration and then what Bush Jr. did and so forth and so on.
Biden.
Yeah, up through Biden. We found that first of all, I think we ultimately decided, just through our own kind of research and the journalism that we did ourselves, that there was something very unique about 88 to 92. It was a particular moment in time that really felt like for us it deserved our attention and focus. We went from a place where we really did not know how we were going to respond to the science as it was presented to us, to a place where the powers that be said, no, I've changed my mind on that, and we're moving to a place where we're not going to try to solve that particular problem. And by the time that was over, it had given the industry enough time to create what we now know as this giant machine of denialism, which is has taken off like a virus. And so when we brought in the Clinton and Bush and Obama and Trump, all that stuff, it's a slightly different conversation and a slightly different set of circumstances and context. And we felt like at the end of the film, it was just kind of, I don't know, that's a new chapter with different rules, different characters, different emotional arc to the story. And so we felt like it was important to show the consequences, and that's why you see, what we call the romp at the end, where you see all the disaster. But because that, in many ways, that can be pinned to the lack of action from that period. But we felt like the books were kind of cooked by that point politically. It was very hard to turn that upside down. I don't know if you had something to add to that.
No, I mean, I think just reminding people there was a time that it wasn't a partisan issue is one of the main things we wanted to have come across. And by adding all those other political layers, we got further away from that kind of core thesis. So there was a version of the film that went all the way from 1860 up until 2024. There was going to be about 9 hours and unwatchable. So we were very proud we got to where we landed.
The rabbit holes are amazing. I did spend a couple of weeks of my life looking at very early photography, kind of obsessing how early photography was also coincided with the beginning of the national park system.
You made a good plea that it should be in there. There was a time.
Yeah, and also coincided with the railroads. And there's a wonderful book by Rebecca Solnit that tackles a lot of this kind of history, which is definitely germane, but it didn't, at the end of the day, fit into the arc of the story for us.
There's also a beautiful 1950s montage that has echoes in the 80s about this time where you were being told you could have whatever you wanted, and that plastic and all these things were the answer to all your problems. That is on the cutting room floor as well. But all these periods of history that could have been in it.
Yeah. It's quite powerful focusing on that particular period and, like you said, those characters that we get to return to throughout. Before we open it up to the audience, I'd love to hear from you both the impact that you hope the film will have as you bring it out into the world.
Great question. We always do, but I think especially with a film like this, really have a lot of ambition about the real world impact. We feel like, having done this for a while now, it's very satisfying when your kid calls you up from college and says, Mom and Dad, your film is on my syllabus. That means to us that this work that we've done has kind of made its way into the DNA of education and can be used and debated and hopefully, survive the test of time. And we feel like this film, we know from talking to environmental professors and people who study the politics and the science and the culture of this subject matter writ large, we feel like this kind of fills a hole that I think could be successful in the educational world. We're planning on doing that. We are in talks with a streamer to get it out also in a mainstream way online so people can watch it. Partnering with groups, environmental groups that we have in the past, like 350.org and Climate Reality and those kinds of places to do screenings for activists who are interested in this, and also trying setting up policy screenings so that policymakers can see this. And it's amazing. I'm becoming a little bit of an old man, but young people don't know this history, and in some ways, I don't know. I'm curious to hear from young people if you stuck around for the Q&A. Our sense is that this could potentially have an activating quality to it, like, oh my God, we made this mistake once. I see how it went down now. We're not going to let that happen again on our watch, kind of thing.
Yeah, and just adding to that, I think it's so easy to, especially right now, to want to burrow in your bed and put your pillow over your head and knock it out. And I think for me, when I watch this film, it's such a good reminder that yes, the American people are part of how we got here, but also the impact they can have by calling their elected officials and by showing up, and that those efforts can really make a difference. And also just to support science and believe scientists, and in this time where it shouldn't be a question, but it is, to remember to keep doing that.
Mm-hmm. It's great. And I noticed we do have some students who stuck around for this. And so Jason Spingarn-Koff is co-teaching a documentary production class with me, as well as a class called Covering the Climate Crisis. And they're in between a unit on the fossil fuel industry and climate policy. So I'd love to invite, as we open it up to the audience, any of the journalism students to ask a question.
Did they stay?
I see a couple of you. I see a few of you.
Or if anyone has a question.
Yeah.
Please wait for the microphone so everyone can hear your question.
I'm just curious about the storyboard. You when you tell a story and you're making a movie, you have some control over what you're going to produce. It's obviously different than finding out what your archival people are going to find for you. So can you talk about that sort of discovery and frustration of the sort of being at the mercy of the best footage that comes up, and also the magical moment when everybody found a clip that you all just walked out feeling like, wow, that made this whole week great?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that in many ways defines, I think, the process of making any documentary film. You kind of have this idea that you have a gut sense there's a story out there. Maybe you've met a character. Maybe you kind of generally have a passion for a particular subject matter. In the case of a film where you go out and shoot material, you have a somewhat amount of control over that, in terms of the casting process and so forth, and even what they say or what you choose to turn your camera on for. In this case, we kind of tied one arm behind our back, in a sense, because we decided not to do that. We generally, like I said, we had this idea that there a lot of activity on the science side. We had these 4 pillars: science, industry, the American public, and activism. And we started thinking about things that would fit into those buckets. It was kind of in a way, kind of an academic way to approach it, but that's what we did in the beginning. And then we sort of slowly started to fill those buckets with potential characters. And then from that, we started to look for material. Stephen Schneider, we knew about James Hansen from previous climate work. He's a famous scientist, perhaps the most famous American climate scientist. Stephen Schneider was famous at the time in the 1980s. He was always on TV, and so he emerged as a character. A lot of this is about who the folks who were making documentaries and news programs back then, what they decided to shoot. He was willing, like he says in the film, he was willing and interested in going to the public, and so there was a lot of stuff. He actually really deepened as a character when we talked to his widow, who told us that Stanford had done some audio recordings where he did his kind of personal professional history on audio tape before he passed away in 2010, and so that added a texture to the film. There's all kinds of amazing stories. We also would read transcripts of presidential press conferences and that kind of thing. And when I read that Carter had said the words, carbon dioxide in 1979, I got excited. And then we thought, okay, how do we find that? And then that was in the Carter library, but it was on a piece of 16 millimeter film that had never been transferred to video. So then we had to wait for that to be transferred and sent to us to see if it could fit into the film. So it was a kind of push and pull process, I think, is the best way to answer your question.
The only thing I'll add there is just because it was so intricately woven, when new footage would come in, part of what made the editing so arduous is you had to almost watch the whole thing to figure out how that piece was going to go in. So people's eyes were so tired. Like, it was just, as far as the edit goes, I think it's one of the hardest that we have been a part of from that standpoint.
Lots of hands.
Hold on one second. I really appreciated this. Having lived through it, I thought you knit together a fantastic, a presentation of what we all lived through, but didn't see it necessarily in the arc. My question is, I felt like at the very end, where Bill Riley says, Bush had this opportunity and he didn't take it. I wanted a little more. So I want to at least hear from you, what was the reason? I mean, was it just all that stuff that industry was spewing out for the last, 4 years? Or was there some other reason why he couldn't embrace climate change as an issue in the way that we, our lives would be different today if he had? Because I really appreciated Bill Riley's thing about saying we were close and we didn't get it.
You're talking about George Bush? I think the Bush thing was interesting because I think before this project, I would have just assumed that Bush had his mind made up prior to 1989 when he took office. And I honestly don't know what was going on in Bush's mind to this day, but we did discover that it documents and news clips and other things that we were able to put together, that it seemed like Bush, at the very least, may have been confused. Maybe he thought that he could have it both ways, that he could do something about, the greenhouse effect, using the White House effect. But it also, in 19 92 when he was running for re-election, I think it also became very clear to him that he had no choice but to side with industry and what he thought were the economic realities of the time, and that he was he allowed himself to be easily persuaded by the denial machine that was up and running partly at the hands of John Sununu at that point. So I think that Riley obviously knew what was going on, and he was trying to do his Boy Scout best to get the president where he thought he needed to be, but the forces were just too, it was sort of so underway by that point that it was almost impossible to do anything about it.
Very good. I was really impressed. Thank you for doing this. It's terrific.
Hi, Merrill.
Hi. I was really impressed by that 14,000 pieces of testimony video documents. Now, a fair number of those, I suspect, were documents. But I found if you set those aside, say, if you wanted to watch all the footage that you have, how long? I mean, you did watch it all.
Alana, do you have
how big is that challenge?
A year. Alana says a year.
Yeah, I mean, I would estimate about a year if you're doing 8-hour days, because the pieces vary in length. And so some of them are 8 hours, 10 hours of C-SPAN coverage on a hearing, and others are 20 minutes, 30 minutes. So 14,000 pieces, not that many of it was documents, actually. A lot of it was video and audio. So yeah, I think a year at least.
Thanks, Alana.
We had a question down here and then several in the center and then one over to the side here.
No question.
Oh, and someone has a microphone. Okay.
I got the mic, yeah. Yeah, I love that how it became such a period piece and kind of focusing on this time that I think I was a 5-year-old when Bush got elected. So I remember vividly in kindergarten, looking up at the screen. And the word sacrifice came up a few times, and it reminded me of this thing I heard about trauma. A trauma is a sacrifice you're willing to make. And I was thinking about how there was a suggestion, I think, as the film got to the second act about Bush kind of, making money in the oil industry. And I kind of wanted to build on Abby's question, but then also maybe look to solutions in some way to point out where the hope could be, or the kind of character that would engender some hope, I think, in the culture, or the kind of mechanism that might actually land some actual change, because it seemed like, okay, if we all could see that this character was, flawed. Yeah. And, so yeah, the cultural, the generational hope, where do you, yeah. Where is it?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. Many films that we had seen about that tackle climate-related stories, I think almost every journalist, filmmaker who tackled it has to think about that at some stage. What do you do? How do you speak to the audience in a way so that they can find a way out of this mess? And sometimes it's super cheesy, like at the end of a film, they might tell you you can change your light bulbs. I think that was the early, kind of in the 20, 25 years ago, that kind of thing. And it's taken different forms in different films over the years. We really struggled with it. We actually had versions of the film where we did have kind of what you might call more hope at the end. We really asked ourselves, is that true, though? I think that the thing that we spent a lot of time thinking about is we really didn't want to tack something on to the end of this very dark story that felt like it was kind of trite in comparison to the heaviness of what actually happened. And we ended up kind of convening some of our colleagues, including Nat Rich, the journalist who wrote that article, and the question came up: is it our responsibility to provide hope, or is it, what is the responsibility of the artist, so to speak, and in the when facing a very dark truth? And we felt like here that our responsibility was just to tell the truth. And this thing happened. It's really ugly. And we're living with the consequences now. That guy Bill Kane, the energy secretary in the 80s, who said, it's not going to happen for 50 years. There's no reason for haste. And 50 years in geologic time is a blink of an eye, obviously. And we are here now, 50 years later. And we're watching our world burn and flood, and people are suffering. And we felt like this particular story just needed to kind of end with the soberness of that message.
I think for me, the hope is in, and we talked about this too, in what Stephen Schneider says at the end about that we have made progress. It just goes at generational change, like the pace is slow. And when you look at where we are, we have made progress. It's not that we've gone, completely backwards. That said, given today's political climate in 2025, I think there are real concerns that we could go back. And so I think really trying to think about having conversations that do look forward, knowing these stakes is where we have to find hope.
Hi. Yeah, I have a two-part question. So one is when I started watching the film, I felt like we were going to take us from that period to 2020, but I assume it was 9-hour long film, so we didn't do that. But I was also curious about the period, the Reagan period, because it felt to me in that moment is like there were rollbacks of regulations which had a huge impact on environment, especially in terms of oil companies. So why did you make that choice? I mean, I know you talked about it, but the choice between why not focus on Reagan era, what I see is had a huge impact on environment because of the rollback of regulations, and just focus on 4 years of Bush administration. Because I also feel like there might have been conflict between the president and the vice president in that time. I don't know, we don't know, but it could be. This is one question. And another question is I have, because the documentary was obviously very interesting in a sense that you showed us graphs and scientific papers and all of that, and I actually read some of it. On screen we did that. So how did you, because when we talk about these papers or these graphs, so we find them usually very boring, but how did you arrive at that conclusion that we are going to show this on screen and make it interesting, include that in a documentary and make it interesting? They are not footage, they are just graphs. So yeah, thank you.
So I think you're asking two questions. One about the focus on the politics rather than the deregulation. Right. Yeah. The early 80s versus the late 80s, and then the second is about the why graphs. What? Yeah. Good questions. Well, I don't know. Did something jump to mind for you?
I was just going to say on the Reagan part, I think you could make a whole film, many films about that period, right? There was a lot of things that happened during that period that led us to where we are today on multiple fronts. But I think we wanted to use that period. And as we shrunk the film and really had to come up with this thesis, we wanted to give you the seminal points. So the deregulation, I'm glad that came through because that was a huge thing. Also the ethos of that time that you shouldn't have to sacrifice. Like you shouldn't, coming out of the gas crisis and coming out of that as I said earlier, you deserve everything you want. There should be no sacrifice. There should be no cost. We're Americans, that we wanted that to come across leading into Bush. So yes, we could have made, but the film would have been much longer. And I think, we needed those creative constraints and around the unique political moment that Bush represented to focus on that. And I think the graphs, I want to give Jon a shout out and the graphics team. Everything from making it look like the dot matrix printer, which I love from that time period, to really finding ways to make those graphs and make those memos jump off the screen and make them, to your point, legible and something that could impact you rather than just have your eyes glaze over.
Yeah, I think that's right about the Reagan years. The other piece for us that became apparent when we studied it is that it is true that Reagan kind of like what's going on literally right now in 2025, Reagan was hell bent on deregulating industry. And he did say those things. Let's hand the energy policy back to the energy companies. At that time, at least in the media, it wasn't so much connected to global warming and the science of climate change. It was the environmentalism in the late 70s and 80s was more a sense of kind of, a lot of concern for wildlife conservation,
air and water,
clean air. In the early 70s, the EPA was established and the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act were passed. And the science of climate change was known among scientists, but not so much broadcast. And certainly presidents were briefed on it. People in the know knew about it. I'm sure Reagan knew what was going on, but the public wasn't so aware yet. And it wasn't until those hearings in the summer of '88, the worst drought in history, the heat wave that happened at that point, and the presidential campaign was underway between Dukakis and Bush, that it really became a publicly known thing. It was on the, literally above the fold of the New York Times. It was on the cover of Time magazine. And so it was, like I said earlier, those 4 years were just unique. They just were, in terms of this particular issue. It's not that it wasn't known under Reagan, and of course he laid the groundwork for a lot of the kind of gestalt of how you do tear apart government regulations, but Bush, Sununu really stepped it up on this issue. The graphs, we had an early idea that was kind of a sort of fun filmmaking device, that we thought that the CO2, the hockey stick, could be kind of like our time travel device. And we really wanted to bring that a lot. We wanted to connect the viewer's experience to a timeline, which obviously this film has a timeline. We wanted to be able to travel back and forth in time a lot, which we do in the film. There's flashbacks. There's actually flashbacks within flashbacks. It's kind of a difficult thing to do in the edit, to keep your head around what's going on and what the context is of certain periods that you didn't necessarily live through. And so we used the science graphs, which are actual documentary evidence. Even though we did kind of fancy them up with a dot matrix look and everything, those are real things out of scientific journals and NASA history and all that science behind it, and that's where it started. So we wanted the people to have the experience of the inevitability of that growing, but also kind of going back and saying, what if we had done something different, and how could that graph have looked different?
Yeah, that's great. So there was a question in the middle here, and now I see one in the
last question.
back. Oh, last question. Okay, who has the microphone?
I do.
Oh, there you are.
My question was I preface this by saying I loved how narrow the story was, and I thought that was really helpful. But my question was about the choice to not show the impact of other issues on muddying the waters at the time, and also to not show activism related to both climate and other things at the time. And I asked that because I was in DC as a 16-year-old in '89, and it was all about Mapplethorpe and HIV.
Right. Yeah. So what's your...
Just the choice to not show that wider social context of what was happening. And to answer part of it is just it got too big. So we had cuts with other activism from the time but there wasn't, in order to make it a cohesive narrative, we had to have those creative constraints. Yeah. But you're absolutely right.
Yeah. We do have, I think we have we sort of tackle that, like Justine was saying before, by kind of widening it out and showing what the culture was paying attention to at the time, rather than paying attention to this kind of material. The activism piece of it, we did actually kind of learn ourselves that there wasn't a lot of activism, particularly about global warming, until much later. Certainly once we get into the turn of the century, and it Inconvenient Truth came out in 2007. Once that starts, there's much more activism in the environmental space around it. But yeah, really in the 80s, it was the environmentalism, as I'm sure a lot of you remember, was about whales and owls and other things, clean air, clean water. But the reducing carbon dioxide came later, and and I think we're also facing a particular moment right now where we see a lot of activism on campuses, but very little of it is climate change related. And I think if you were to make a film out now, you might wonder, why are we not paying attention now to what we consider to be the most important issue, whereas passions run so high on other issues of the day.
Rightly so. It's a conundrum for sure.
So before we wrap up, another quick reminder, please join us next week. This series continues Saturday, February 8th at 3 p.m. for the film Nocturnes. Thank you so much for our host at BAMFA. And Jon and Justine, thank you so much for sharing the film with us and for this really great Q&A. And thank you all for coming out.